The shepherd's teeth were bared, his body wedged between the metal door and its frame, and when Margaret reached for the padlock, the growl that rose from his throat sounded less like a warning and more like grief made audible. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, tell us where you're watching from. And to make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or life-changing discoveries, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. Her husband, Frank, stepped back, his arthritic hand still clutching the bolt cutters. The August sun beat down on the concrete lot of Valley View Storage, turning the air thick and heavy. Sweat traced lines down his weathered face, but he didn't move to wipe it away. His eyes were fixed on the dog, a German Shepherd mix, ribs visible beneath a coat that might once have been golden brown, but now hung dull and matted with dirt. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "How long has he been here?" The storage facility manager, a younger man named Devin with a clipboard tucked under his arm, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Unit's been abandoned for 4 months. Owners stopped paying in April. We sent notices, made calls, nothing. Protocol says we auction off the contents after 90 days of non-payment." He glanced at the dog, then quickly away. "I didn't know about the dog. I swear to God, I didn't know." Margaret had been married to Frank for 43 years. She knew the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders squared when he was deciding whether to walk away from trouble or march straight into it. She watched him now, watched the calculation happening behind his pale blue eyes. They'd come here looking for cheap furniture, maybe some tools Frank could restore and resell. Retirement had been harder than either of them expected. Their savings had dwindled faster than anticipated, eaten away by medical bills and the rising cost of everything. The storage auction had seemed like a harmless gamble, $50 for a unit they couldn't even see inside. "We need to call animal control," Devin said, pulling out his phone. "No." The word came from Margaret, sharp and immediate. Both men turned to look at her. She was already moving forward, her steps slow and deliberate. The dog's growl intensified, but she kept her gaze averted, her body language loose. She had grown up on a farm in Nebraska. She knew animals, knew the language of fear and loyalty. "Margaret," Frank started. "He's starving," she said quietly. She could see it now, the way the dog's legs trembled, the desperate quality in his eyes that went beyond simple aggression. "He's been guarding this door, waiting. He thinks his person is coming back." The dog's growl faltered, just for a moment. Margaret stopped about 6 feet away, slowly lowering herself to sit cross-legged on the hot pavement. Her knees protested. Arthritis was a cruel companion in her 70s, but she ignored the pain. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out the turkey sandwich she'd packed for lunch. Frank had been after her to eat more, said she was getting too thin. Well, here was a better use for it. She unwrapped the sandwich and tore off a piece of turkey, tossing it gently toward the dog. It landed about 2 feet from his position. He stared at it, then at her, his body rigid with conflict. Hunger warred with duty in his eyes. "It's okay, boy," Margaret murmured. "You've been so good. You've been so faithful. But you're allowed to eat now. You're allowed to rest." The dog's nose twitched. Another long moment passed. Then, moving with painful slowness, he stretched his neck forward and snatched the meat, swallowing it almost without chewing. Frank knelt beside his wife, his knees cracking audibly. Together, they worked through the sandwich, creating a trail of food that led away from the storage unit. When the last piece was gone, Margaret pulled out the granola bar from her bag and unwrapped it. The dog was closer now, maybe 3 feet away. She could smell him, the rank odor of an animal that had been living rough, but underneath it, the faint scent of shampoo. Someone had cared for this dog once. Someone had loved him. "Can you get the lock?" Margaret asked Frank without taking her eyes off the shepherd. Frank hesitated, then nodded. He moved slowly, telegraphing every motion. The bolt cutters closed around the padlock with a metallic click that made the dog's ears flatten. But he didn't lunge, didn't bare his teeth again. He was watching Margaret, watching the hand that held the last of the granola bar. The lock gave way with a sharp crack. Frank pulled it free and rolled up the metal door. The interior of the unit exhaled a breath of stale air, tinged with something else, something organic and sweet that made Margaret's stomach clench. "Oh, God," Devin said from behind them. He'd moved close enough to see inside. "Oh, Jesus." Margaret didn't turn. She extended her hand, the granola bar resting on her palm. The dog took a halting step forward, then another. His dark eyes were fixed on hers now, searching for something, permission perhaps, or forgiveness. When he finally took the food from her hand, his tongue was gentle against her palm, his teeth never making contact with her skin. "Good boy," she whispered. "Such a good boy." Only then did she look past the dog into the storage unit beyond. The space was perhaps 10 feet by 15 feet. In the dim light filtering past them, Margaret could make out the shapes of furniture. A couch pushed against the far wall, a small table, a lamp without a shade. There were boxes stacked in one corner, and hanging on the wall, framed photographs. But what drew her eye was the pile of blankets on the floor near the back wall, and the shape beneath them that was just slightly too still, too angular to be simply more discarded belongings. Frank's hand found her shoulder. His fingers trembled slightly. "Devin," Frank said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hand, "you need to call the police, right now." The younger man had already stumbled backward, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand covering his mouth. Margaret could hear him talking to the dispatcher, his words coming fast and high-pitched. She looked down at the dog. He had finished the granola bar and was staring up at her with those dark, intelligent eyes. She reached out slowly and rested her hand on his head. His fur was rough, full of tangles and debris, but warm, alive. His tail gave a single, tentative wag. "What's your name, boy?" she asked, softly. The dog whined, a sound that carved straight through Margaret's chest. She'd heard grief before, had made that sound herself when they'd gotten the call about their daughter's car accident 15 years ago, when the doctor had said the word unsurvivable in that calm, practiced tone. This was that same sound, rendered in a different voice. Frank moved into the unit, his feet shuffling carefully across the concrete floor. Margaret wanted to call him back, wanted to preserve this space as it was, but she understood why he needed to look. They'd bought this unit. Whatever was inside, whatever had happened here, was now somehow their responsibility. "Margaret," Frank said, after a moment. His voice had changed, gone soft with something that might have been wonder or might have been horror. "You need to see this." She rose to her feet with effort, her knees screaming in protest. The dog pressed against her leg as she moved, staying close as though afraid she might vanish if he lost contact. Together, they entered the storage unit. The first thing she noticed was how carefully everything had been arranged. This wasn't someone who had hastily shoved their belongings into storage and walked away. The furniture was positioned as though the space was a tiny apartment. The couch facing the table, a braided rug spread beneath them. On the table sat a portable electric hot plate, a small cooler, and a neat stack of what looked like bills and papers. The walls were decorated with photographs in mismatched frames. A young woman with dark hair and sharp cheekbones, holding the German Shepherd as a puppy. The same woman in military fatigues, standing in front of a desert landscape. The woman and the dog on a hiking trail, both covered in mud and grinning. She was living here, Margaret said, and it wasn't a question. Frank nodded toward the pile of blankets. I think it happened while she was sleeping. There's medication bottles here." He pointed to the floor near the makeshift bed, empty ones. Margaret's throat tightened. She moved closer, careful not to disturb anything. The shape beneath the blankets was small. The woman in the photographs had been petite, probably not more than 5'3". How long had she been lying there, Margaret wondered, while her faithful dog stood guard at the door, waiting for her to wake up? "Look at this," Frank said. He was standing by the boxes in the corner, holding a leather-bound journal. "There's a whole stack of these. And look." He gestured to the boxes themselves. They were labeled in neat print. Afghanistan deployment 2012 to 2013. Medical records, VA correspondence, legal documents. Margaret took the journal from Frank's hands. The leather was worn smooth, the pages edged in gold. She opened it to a random entry, dated 3 months earlier. May 15th. Max has been my anchor through another hard day. The VA denied my appeal again, 3rd time. They say the documentation isn't sufficient to prove service connection for my condition. As if the nightmares, the pain, the inability to hold down a job were somehow coincidental. As if I chose this. The eviction notice came today. I have until the end of the month. I've applied to every shelter within 50 miles, but the waiting lists are months long, and most won't take Max. I will not abandon him. I cannot. He saved my life in Kandahar, pulled me out of a burning Humvee when I couldn't move, couldn't think through the pain and the smoke. He found me in the dark when I was bleeding out in the desert, barking until the medics came. How could I leave him behind now? We're in this together, Max and I. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Margaret's vision blurred. She blinked hard, forcing the tears back. Frank was reading over her shoulder, his breath coming harsh and uneven. "Jesus," he muttered. She was homeless. She was a veteran, Margaret corrected, though she knew they were saying the same thing. And she chose to live in a storage unit rather than give up her dog. Outside, sirens were getting closer. Devin appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Police are coming, and an ambulance, though I told them—" He trailed off, glancing at the blankets, then quickly away. The dog, Max, Margaret thought, his name is Max, pressed harder against her leg. She looked down at him and saw that he was shaking, his whole body vibrating with tension. He knew what sirens meant. He probably knew what came next. People would arrive, questions would be asked, and eventually someone would take away the woman he'd been guarding. Someone would take him away too. "No," Margaret said aloud. Frank looked at her. "Margaret?" "No," she repeated, more firmly this time. She knelt and wrapped her arms around Max's neck, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs. He leaned into her, that deep whine rising from his chest again. "We're not letting them take him to a shelter. He's been through enough." "We can't just," Frank started, then stopped. Margaret watched the resolve settle over his features, the way it always did when he'd made a decision. "All right," he said. "Well, figure it out." The next hours passed in a blur of uniforms and questions. The police were respectful but thorough. The woman's name had been Captain Elena Vasquez, they learned, 37 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan, honorably discharged after an IED blast left her with a traumatic brain injury and chronic pain. She'd been fighting the VA for disability benefits for 5 years. When her savings ran out and she lost her apartment, she'd moved into the storage unit with Max, scraping by on odd jobs and dwindling credit cards. The medical examiner estimated she'd been dead for approximately 3.5 months. Based on the medication bottles and the journal entries, it appeared she'd taken a deliberate overdose, though they'd need an autopsy to confirm. The last entry in the journal was dated April 22nd. "I'm tired. So tired of fighting, of hurting, of being invisible. The VA sent another denial today. 6 years of appeals, 6 years of proving over and over that I'm damaged, that I'm suffering, that I deserve help. I've sold everything I can sell. I have $93 left to my name. The storage facility is going to evict me at the end of the week. Apparently, it's against regulations to actually live in the units. Who knew? I've tried every shelter, every program, every option. There's nothing left. Nothing except one final choice. I know it's selfish. I know Max deserves better. I've arranged for my friend Teresa to take him, left her a letter, gave Devin her number to call if anything happens to me. She loves Max. She'll give him a good home. I just hope he understands. I hope he knows I'm not abandoning him, that I'm just stepping off the battlefield. I'm done fighting. I want to rest. But Teresa had never received the letter. When the police tracked her down, she was devastated. She'd been wondering why Elena had stopped returning her calls, had assumed she'd relocated to another state in search of better opportunities. She had no idea how desperate things had become. And Devin had never found any emergency contact information. It must have been lost in the facility's filing system, or perhaps Elena had never managed to deliver it. So Max had stayed, guarding the only home he had left, waiting for a person who would never wake up. Throughout the official proceedings, Margaret kept Max close. She sat on the curb with him while the medical examiner's van arrived, her hand stroking his head, murmuring reassurances she wasn't sure he understood. Frank brought water from their car, and they used Margaret's spare blouse to fashion a makeshift bowl. Max drank deeply, desperately, water dripping from his muzzle. When had he last had water? There had been a bowl in the storage unit, near the door, but it had been bone dry. "There's a drainage gutter in the back," Devin said quietly, noticing Margaret's confusion. "Runs along the back wall of this row. When it rains, water collects there. I think he's been drinking from that. And there's a dumpster for the strip mall next door. I've seen raccoons getting into it. Devin swallowed hard. "I should have known something was wrong. The smell, the dog. I should have checked." "You couldn't have known," Frank said, though his tone lacked conviction. A female police officer approached, her expression sympathetic. "We need to call animal control for the dog," she said gently. "He'll need to be checked out by a vet, and then—" "He's coming home with us," Margaret interrupted. The officer blinked. "Ma'am, that's very kind, but there's a process. The dog will need to be evaluated, his vaccinations verified. Then we'll take him to a vet ourselves," Margaret said. "Today, right now. But he's not going into the system. He's been through enough." "Margaret," Frank said softly. "We can't afford." "Then we'll find a way," she said, turning to look at her husband. "Frank, he stayed. For months, he stayed. Starving, alone, drinking rainwater from a gutter, but he stayed at his post. He kept faith. How can we do less?" Frank looked at Max, who was staring up at them with those dark, knowing eyes. The dog's tail gave another tentative wag. Frank's shoulders sagged in defeat, or perhaps acceptance. "Fine," he said. "We'll figure it out." The officer looked between them, then at Max. "I need to confirm with my sergeant," she said, "but given the circumstances, let me see what I can do." It took another hour of negotiation, phone calls, and paperwork, but eventually it was arranged. Margaret and Frank would take Max directly to a veterinary clinic for evaluation. They'd need to pay for his care, get him up to date on shots, have him checked for diseases. If everything cleared, they could foster him while the legal questions surrounding Elena's estate were sorted out. There were no known relatives, no will, no one to claim responsibility for the dog. In practice, Max would be theirs unless someone came forward. By the time they loaded Max into the back seat of their ancient Honda Accord, the sun was setting, painting the storage facility in shades of amber and rust. Margaret sat in back with the dog, her arm around his shoulders. He was shaking again, his body pressed against hers as Frank started the engine. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're safe now. You're coming home." Max turned his head and licked her hand. It was a small gesture, simple, but it broke something loose in Margaret's chest. The tears she'd been holding back all afternoon finally came, silent and hot, tracking down her weathered cheeks. Frank met her eyes in the rearview mirror. He was crying too. They drove to the emergency veterinary clinic in silence. Max stayed pressed against Margaret's side, his breathing gradually slowing, his trembling easing. By the time they pulled into the parking lot, he'd fallen into an uneasy sleep, his head resting in Margaret's lap. The veterinarian who examined him was a young woman with kind eyes and efficient hands. Max was severely malnourished, she told them, and dehydrated. He had intestinal parasites, a skin infection, and his teeth were in poor shape, likely from gnawing on the metal doorframe of the storage unit. But there was no sign of disease, and his temperament was remarkably stable given what he'd been through. With proper care, good nutrition, and time, he would recover fully. The bill came to $473. Frank pulled out their credit card without hesitation, though Margaret saw the way his jaw tightened. They'd been trying to pay down that card, had been making progress. This would set them back months. "We'll manage," Frank said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. They left with Max bandaged, medicated, and equipped with a bag of prescription dog food, antibiotics, and antiparasitic medication. The clinic had even given him a bath, on the house, the young vet had said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew what they'd taken on, she knew what it would cost them. It was nearly midnight by the time they pulled into the driveway of their small ranch house on the outskirts of town. Max woke as the engine shut off, his head lifting from Margaret's lap. He looked around at the unfamiliar surroundings, his ears flicking forward and back. "Home," Margaret said softly. "This is home now, Max." Getting him inside was easier than expected. He followed Margaret closely, his body still pressed against her leg, as though afraid of losing contact. Frank had gone ahead to clear a space in the living room, pushing aside the TV tray they used for dinner and the stack of medical bills on the coffee table. He spread an old comforter on the floor near the couch, creating a makeshift bed. Max circled the blanket 3 times before lying down with a heavy sigh. His eyes remained open, tracking Margaret's movements as she settled onto the couch above him, one hand resting on his head. "You should eat something," Frank said, heading toward the kitchen. "I'm not hungry." Margaret couldn't imagine eating, not with Elena's journal entries still echoing in her mind. That young woman, barely older than what their own daughter would have been, choosing to end her life in a storage unit rather than surrender her dog to a shelter. Dying alone in the dark while the system that should have protected her sent another denial letter. Frank returned with 2 glasses of water and a bottle of Margaret's heart medication. "Take your pill," he said, pressing it into her hand. "You're no good to anyone if you end up in the hospital." She swallowed the medication obediently, too tired to argue. Frank sat beside her on the couch, his hand finding hers. They sat in silence, listening to Max's breathing gradually deepen and slow as he finally, truly surrendered to sleep. "What are we going to do?" Frank asked after a while. "We can barely make ends meet as it is." "I know," Margaret said. "Dog food isn't cheap, and he's going to need follow-up vet visits, more medication." "I know. We're already behind on the electric bill, and your specialist appointment next month." "I know, Frank." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I know all of it. But look at him." She nodded toward Max, who was finally sleeping peacefully, his paws twitching in some dream. He didn't give up. For months, starving and alone, he didn't abandon his post. Elena wrote that he saved her life in Afghanistan. He pulled her from a burning vehicle, found her in the dark when she was dying. And what did she do for him? She made sure he had water and food even when she had nothing. She chose to live in a storage unit rather than give him up. The least we can do, the very least, is give him a chance. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Well, figure it out," he said, echoing his words from earlier. "We always do." But lying awake hours later, Margaret stared at the ceiling and wondered if that was true. They'd been figuring it out for years now, ever since Frank's construction company went under during the recession, ever since Margaret's heart condition had forced her into early retirement from her nursing job. They'd been figuring it out through the foreclosure of their first house, the bankruptcy, the moves to progressively smaller rentals. They'd been figuring it out when their daughter died and the grief counseling wasn't covered by insurance, when the funeral costs had maxed out their last credit card. How much more could they figure out? The next morning brought a new set of challenges. Max woke with the dawn, his bladder desperate after days of holding it to maintain his guard post. Frank had to carry him to the backyard. The dog's legs were too weak to manage the porch steps. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Max relieved himself with obvious relief, then collapsed on the grass, panting. "He can't even walk properly," Frank said, coming back inside. "Margaret, what if we're in over our heads?" Before she could answer, Max appeared in the kitchen doorway, having somehow marshaled the strength to climb the steps. He moved directly to Margaret, pressing his body against her legs, his tail wagging slowly. When she reached down to pet him, he looked up at her with such transparent gratitude, such absolute trust, that her throat closed up. "We're not in over our heads," she said firmly. "We're exactly where we need to be." Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Frank took over Max's morning walks, more accurately, morning sits in the yard, while Max slowly regained his strength. Margaret handled feeding, carefully measuring out the prescription food and monitoring how much he ate. They both took turns with the medications, Frank holding Max still while Margaret administered pills wrapped in deli meat. The dog's recovery was slower than either of them expected. His body, pushed beyond its limits during those months of starvation, seemed reluctant to believe that food would keep coming, that care would continue. He followed Margaret everywhere, his anxiety spiking whenever she left his sight. At night, he slept on the floor beside their bed, his breathing a constant reminder of the responsibility they'd taken on. Money became even tighter. The credit card bill arrived, now carrying the weight of the emergency vet visit. Frank took on additional odd jobs, lawn care for neighbors, small repairs, anything that would bring in a few extra dollars. Margaret started selling things on Facebook Marketplace. Her mother's china set that had been in storage, Frank's old tools that he no longer had the strength to use, books they'd collected over the years. Each sale felt like shedding a piece of their history, but each sale meant another week of dog food, another bottle of medication. 2 weeks after bringing Max home, Margaret returned to the storage facility. The police had released the scene, and the facility manager had cleared out Elena's unit, boxing up her possessions to be held in case any relatives came forward. Margaret had asked to see the boxes before they went into storage. Devin led her to a small office filled with cardboard boxes, each labeled with Elena's name and unit number. He looked uncomfortable, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted. "She was living right here, and I had no idea. I walk past these units every day. I heard the dog sometimes, thought he was just, I don't know. I should have checked." "You can't save everyone," Margaret said gently, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Wasn't that the lesson here? That they should try? That giving up meant letting people die alone in storage units while their dogs stood guard? She opened the first box. Inside were the journals, a dozen of them chronicling Elena's journey from bright-eyed military recruit to broken veteran fighting a system designed to help her. Margaret spent 3 hours reading them while Devin worked in the office nearby. She learned about Elena's childhood in Arizona, her decision to enlist after 9/11, her pride in serving her country. She read about the IED blast that changed everything, the months of surgeries and rehabilitation, the medical discharge that felt more like abandonment. She read about the years of fighting the VA, the bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to exhaust claimants into giving up. She read about the jobs Elena lost when the pain became unbearable, the apartments she couldn't afford, the slow slide into homelessness that she'd tried desperately to prevent. And woven through every entry was Max. Max, who sensed her panic attacks before they happened and pressed against her until she could breathe. Max, who kept her tethered to life when the pain made her want to let go. Max, who gave her a reason to get up each morning because he needed her, even if the rest of the world had decided she was disposable. The final box contained Elena's military records, medals, photographs, and a sealed envelope marked "To whom it may concern." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside was dated April 22nd, the same date as Elena's final journal entry. It was addressed to no one and everyone, a last testament from a woman the world had failed. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I want to make something clear. This is not a cry for help. I'm past help. The system designed to support veterans failed me at every turn. 6 years of fighting. 6 years of proving my pain, my disability, my service, and all I got were denials and waiting lists and condescending lectures about resilience. I watched my savings disappear into medical bills for treatment the VA wouldn't cover. I watched my credit crumble as I fell further behind on everything. I watched apartments turn me away because my medical history made me a liability, because my PTSD made me difficult, because having a large dog meant I wasn't a good tenant. The VA said my traumatic brain injury wasn't service-connected, despite clear documentation of the IED blast that caused it. They said my chronic pain was insufficient for disability benefits. They said a lot of things, mostly about how I wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't documenting correctly, wasn't being patient enough with their process. I was patient for 6 years. I followed every procedure, filed every form, attended every appointment. I did everything right, and they still left me to die alone in a storage unit. But this letter isn't about blame. It's about Max. If you found this, please take care of him. He's the best thing in my life, the one thing that didn't fail me. He deserves better than I could give him. There's a woman named Teresa Rodriguez. Her number should be in my phone. She loves Max and promised to take him if anything happened to me. Please, please make sure he goes to her. Don't let him end up in a shelter. He's been through enough. To the VA, to the system, to everyone who said I wasn't sick enough, wasn't documented enough, wasn't worthy enough, I hope someday you fix what's broken. I hope someday other veterans don't have to make the choice I'm making. I hope someday service actually means something more than a thank you on Veterans Day and a flag on your coffin. To Max, I'm sorry. You deserved better. You always did. I love you. Captain Elena Vasquez, United States Army. Margaret folded the letter with shaking hands and tucked it back into the envelope. She sat in the quiet storage office, surrounded by the boxed remnants of a life that should have meant something more, and felt rage settle in her chest alongside the grief. Elena had been right. The system had failed her. Society had failed her. And in the end, the only one who hadn't failed her was the dog who'd stood guard over her body for months, faithful to the last. When Margaret got home, she found Frank in the living room with Max. The dog's condition had improved markedly in the past 2 weeks. His coat was beginning to shine, his ribs less prominent, his legs stronger. He was lying with his head in Frank's lap while Frank absently stroked his ears, watching a baseball game with the sound muted. "How was it?" Frank asked. Margaret told him everything. About the journals, the letter, the years of fighting a system that should have protected one of its own. By the time she finished, Frank's jaw was tight, his free hand clenched into a fist on the couch beside him. "Someone should pay for this," he said. "Who?" Margaret asked. "Which part of the bureaucracy do you sue? Which individual do you blame when it's the whole system that's broken? Frank had no answer. Max stirred, lifting his head to look at Margaret. He climbed carefully off the couch and came to her, pressing his nose into her palm. She knelt and wrapped her arms around his neck, breathing in the clean scent of dog shampoo and the underlying warmth of his fur. "We can't fix what happened to Elena," she whispered into Max's fur. "But we can make sure you're okay. We can do that much." That evening, Margaret created a Facebook post. She wasn't social media savvy, had only joined at her daughter's insistence years ago, and had barely used it since her death. But she understood that sometimes stories needed to be told. Sometimes people needed to know. She wrote about Elena, about a veteran who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, who'd been injured saving her squad mates, who'd come home to find that the government she'd served had no room for her broken pieces. She wrote about the years of fighting for benefits, the descent into homelessness, the ultimate choice to end her pain. She wrote about Max, who'd stayed faithful when everything else failed, who'd guarded his person even in death. And then she wrote about the cost of caring. The vet bills, the medication, the food. The strain on their own fragile finances. She didn't ask for money, couldn't bring herself to do that. But she asked people to remember, to care, to check on their veteran neighbors, to demand better from the systems that were supposed to protect those who'd protected them. She posted it at 9 p.m. and went to bed, not expecting much. In her experience, the internet was good at momentary outrage, but poor at sustained action. She'd said what needed saying. That would have to be enough. She woke at 6 a.m. to find her phone vibrating continuously with notifications. The post had been shared 200 times, then 500. By the time she and Frank sat down for breakfast, it had reached 3,000 shares. Her email inbox was flooded with messages from veterans organizations, animal rescue groups, journalists, and ordinary people who wanted to help. "Margaret," Frank said, staring at his own phone. "What did you do?" "I told the truth," she said simply. By noon, a local news crew was at their door. Margaret hadn't agreed to an interview, but apparently the story was too compelling to ignore. She let them film Max, let them capture his gentle eyes and recovering condition. She showed them Elena's letter, with the names redacted to protect privacy, and read excerpts from the journals. She talked about the storage unit, the months Max had spent alone, the choice Elena had been forced to make. "What do you want people to know?" the reporter asked, a young man with earnest eyes who couldn't have been more than 25. Margaret looked at Max, who was lying at her feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "I want people to know that this shouldn't have happened. Elena served her country, saved lives, came home damaged, and we threw her away. The system is supposed to catch people before they fall this far. It's supposed to help, not hinder. And I want people to know that even now, even after everything, the cost of making this right falls on ordinary people like us who can barely afford it ourselves. We're drowning trying to save a dog, and that's somehow supposed to be enough of a solution." "Would you do it differently?" the reporter asked. "If you could go back to that day at the storage unit, knowing what it would cost, would you still take Max?" Margaret didn't hesitate. Yes, every time. Yes, because somebody has to. Somebody has to stand up and say that lives matter, human and animal. Somebody has to refuse to walk away. Elena couldn't keep fighting, but Max did, and now we're fighting for him. That's what you do. That's what you're supposed to do. The interview aired that evening on the local news. By the next morning, it had gone national. Margaret's phone rang constantly. Reporters, podcasters, bloggers, all wanting to tell Elena's story. The GoFundMe that someone had created without Margaret's knowledge had raised $15,000. Veterans organizations were demanding investigations into the VA's handling of Elena's case. Politicians were making statements about reforming benefits procedures. The attention was overwhelming and exhausting. Margaret had never wanted to be a spokesperson, had never imagined standing in front of cameras talking about bureaucratic failures and systemic problems. But she did it because Elena couldn't. Because someone needed to point at the storage unit, at the woman who died there, at the dog who'd refused to leave, and say, "This is unacceptable. This is shameful. This is our collective failure." The money from the GoFundMe covered Max's care and then some. Margaret and Frank set aside what they needed for his continued treatment and donated the rest to a veterans organization that helped homeless former service members, particularly those with pets, who often fell through the cracks of shelter systems that didn't allow animals. Max's physical recovery continued steadily. His weight normalized, his coat grew glossy, his energy returned. The psychological recovery took longer. He startled at loud noises, paced anxiously when Margaret was out of sight, sometimes woke in the night with whimpers that sounded heartbreakingly human. On those nights, Margaret would climb out of bed and lie on the floor beside him, her arm draped over his body, murmuring reassurances until he calmed. 3 months after they'd found Max at the storage unit, Margaret received a call from Teresa Rodriguez, the friend Elena had wanted to take Max. Teresa had been out of the country for 6 months, working with Doctors Without Borders in Syria. She'd only just returned and learned what had happened. She was devastated, and she wanted to meet Max. Margaret invited her over, unsure how she felt about it. Elena had wanted Max to go to Teresa. It was in her letter, her final wish. But Max was theirs now. They'd fought for him, cared for him, loved him through his recovery. The thought of giving him up made Margaret's chest ache. Teresa arrived on a Saturday afternoon. She was younger than Margaret expected, mid-30s, with Elena's same dark hair and sharp cheekbones. She carried a photo album and a box of dog treats, the same brand Elena had apparently always bought. Max went to her immediately. His tail wagged with excitement, his whole body wiggling with recognition. He knew her scent, remembered her voice. Teresa dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him, and they stayed like that for a long moment, woman and dog reunited in their shared grief. "I should have been here," Teresa said, her voice muffled against Max's fur. "I should have called more, checked on her. I knew she was struggling, but I didn't know how bad it had gotten. I thought she'd text if she needed me. I thought—" Her voice broke. Margaret knelt beside them, her hand resting on Max's back. "You couldn't have known," she said, though the words felt inadequate. How many times had Devin said the same thing? How many times had Margaret herself thought it? They all should have known. That was the truth of it. Elena hadn't been invisible. She'd been ignored. They spent the afternoon together, looking through the photo album Teresa had brought. Pictures of Elena and Teresa in college, young and laughing. Pictures of the day Elena had adopted Max from a military dog program. He'd washed out of explosive detection training for being too friendly, and Elena had fallen in love with him immediately. Pictures of birthdays, holidays, deployment send-offs, and homecomings. "She was the strongest person I knew," Teresa said, tracing her finger over a photo of Elena in uniform. "She pulled me through nursing school, helped me deal with family issues, supported every crazy decision I made. When I got accepted to Doctors Without Borders, she threw me a party, even though I know she was scared of losing touch. And then I did lose touch. I got busy saving strangers in war zones and didn't notice my best friend was dying in a storage unit." "She didn't want you to know," Margaret said gently. She showed Teresa the journals, the entries where Elena talked about not wanting to burden her friends, not wanting to be pitied or saved. She was proud. She wanted to handle it herself. "And she did," Teresa said bitterly. "She handled it by taking a bottle of pills and lying down to die alone." They were quiet for a moment. Max had settled between them, his head resting on Teresa's knee, his eyes half closed. He looked content, peaceful in a way Margaret hadn't seen before. "I wanted to ask," Teresa said finally. "In Elena's letter, she wanted Max to come to me, and I want that. I loved him before, and I love him now. But," she looked at Margaret, But he's yours now, isn't he? You saved him. You nursed him back to health. I can see the way he follows you, the way he trusts you. I can't just take him away from that." Margaret's throat tightened. "Elena wanted him to go to you," she said. "Her last wish. Elena thought I'd be here," Teresa interrupted. "She thought I'd find the letter right away, that Max would come to someone he knew and loved. She didn't account for you, for people who would take in a broken, starving dog and pour your own limited resources into saving him." She smiled sadly. "Elena always said she believed in miracles, but rarely saw them. I think you're the miracle she didn't live to see." "What are you saying?" Frank asked. He'd been quiet throughout the visit, sitting in his armchair, watching the interactions. "I'm saying Max should stay with you," Teresa said. She looked down at the dog, her hand stroking his ears. "I'll visit, if that's okay. I want to be part of his life, but he's found his people. Elena would want him to be where he's loved and cared for. She'd want him to be home." Teresa's voice cracked on the last word, and suddenly she was crying, tears streaming down her face as she held on to Max. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry I wasn't there." Margaret moved to embrace her, and they cried together. Two women who'd loved the same broken soldier in different ways, united in their failure to save her and their determination to honor her memory by protecting the dog she'd loved more than her own life. When Teresa left that evening, she took the photo album and Elena's medals, but she left Max behind. She promised to visit every month, and she kept that promise. She became part of their extended family, the younger woman who'd lost her best friend, finding solace in regular visits with the dog they'd both loved. 6 months after finding Max, Margaret received a letter from the VA. It was a form letter, cold and bureaucratic, informing her that they were looking into Elena Vazquez's case as part of a wider review of denied benefit claims. It was too late, of course. Elena was gone. But the letter represented something. A crack in the system. A tiny acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, something had gone wrong. Margaret filed the letter away with Elena's journals. She'd become the unofficial keeper of Elena's story. The person reporters called when they wanted to follow up on veterans' issues. The face people associated with the fight for better benefits and support. She testified before a congressional committee, her testimony broadcast on C-SPAN to an audience of dozens. She started a small nonprofit, funded by the excess GoFundMe money, that helped homeless veterans keep their pets while finding housing. It wasn't much, it wouldn't save everyone, but it was something. Frank worried about her health. The stress of the advocacy work, the constant phone calls and meetings was wearing on her. Her heart condition required careful management, and she wasn't always careful. But when he tried to talk to her about slowing down, she'd look at Max and shake her head. Elena couldn't keep fighting, she'd say. Someone has to. A year after finding Max, Margaret and Frank attended the dedication of a small memorial garden at Valley View Storage Facility. The facility's owner, shamed by the publicity, had donated a corner of the property to create a space honoring veterans who'd fallen through the cracks. Elena's name was engraved on a bronze plaque, along with dozens of others, men and women who'd served their country and died homeless, forgotten, abandoned by the systems meant to protect them. Max came with them to the dedication. He walked steadily now, his head high, his coat gleaming in the autumn sunlight. When they reached Elena's plaque, he sat and stared at it for a long moment, his tail still. Margaret wondered what he understood, if he knew this was for the woman he'd guarded so faithfully. Then Max stood, walked to the plaque, and gently pressed his nose against Elena's engraved name. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. Frank's arm went around her shoulders, steadying her. Around them, other attendees were crying too. Veterans, advocates, families who'd lost loved ones to the same failed systems. A local VA official gave a speech about reforms and commitment to doing better. Margaret listened with skepticism. She'd heard similar promises before. But when the official finished and approached her privately, There was something different in his eyes. Shame, perhaps, or genuine determination. "We failed, Captain Vasquez," he said quietly. "I can't change that. But I can promise you that we're implementing new procedures. Faster appeals, better outreach, more support for veterans with pets, mandatory wellness checks for anyone who's been denied multiple times. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's something. It's a start," Margaret said, because what else was there to say? Elena was gone. All the reforms in the world wouldn't bring her back. But maybe, they'd prevent the next storage unit, the next desperate choice, the next dog standing guard over his person's body. That night, Margaret sat on the couch with Max's head in her lap, Frank beside her reading the newspaper. The house was quiet, peaceful. On the mantel sat a photo Teresa had given them. Elena in her uniform, young and strong, with Max as a puppy in her arms. Both of them were smiling. "Do you think she knows?" Margaret asked softly. "Elena, do you think she knows he's okay?" Frank set down his newspaper and looked at the photo. "I don't know about heaven or ghosts or any of that," he said. "But I know that she loved him enough to live in a storage unit rather than give him up. She loved him enough to make sure he had water even when she was dying. That kind of love doesn't just disappear. So, yeah, maybe she knows. Maybe somewhere she's at peace knowing he found his way home." Max sighed deeply, his body relaxing completely under Margaret's gentle touch. His eyes drifted closed. He was safe now. Fed, loved, cared for. The months of standing guard were over. He could rest. Margaret thought about the day they'd found him, teeth bared, body wedged in the doorway, refusing to leave his post. She thought about his dedication, his faith, his absolute refusal to abandon the person he loved, even when that person was beyond saving. It was the kind of loyalty that defied logic, that transcended the basic instinct for survival. It was, Margaret thought, the kind of loyalty that shamed humanity. Because humans, for all their intelligence and capability, had let Elena Vasquez die alone while her dog stood guard. But Max was safe now, and maybe that was enough. Maybe saving one dog, honoring one veteran's memory, fighting for small changes in a broken system, maybe that was enough to live with. It wasn't justice, it wasn't redemption, but it was something. 2 years later, Margaret stood in the parking lot of a newly opened Veterans Resource Center. The building was modest, converted from an old church, but inside were caseworkers, counselors, housing specialists, and a pet-friendly emergency shelter. The center was named for Elena Vasquez, funded by donations and grants that had flowed in after the story went national. Max stood beside Margaret, older now, his muzzle touched with gray. Frank was there too, his hand in Margaret's, both of them weathered by the years but still standing. Teresa had come for the opening, and she stood with them, her hand resting on Max's head. She would have hated having a building named after her, Teresa said with a sad smile. She didn't want to be a symbol, she just wanted help. "Then we'll make sure this place actually helps people," Margaret replied. "No bureaucracy, no endless waiting lists, no denials, just people helping people. That's what Elena deserved. That's what everyone deserves." The ribbon was cut, the doors opened, and the first clients began arriving. Veterans with haunted eyes and dogs at their sides, looking for someone, anyone, who would help them before it was too late. Margaret and Frank stayed for hours, greeting people, hearing stories, offering what comfort they could. Max stayed close to Margaret, as he always did, his presence a reminder of why this mattered. As the sun set and the crowd thinned, Margaret found herself alone for a moment in the small memorial room they'd set up. Elena's photo hung on the wall, along with her medals and a copy of the letter she'd written in the storage unit. Below it was a simple plaque with words Margaret had chosen. "Captain Elena Vasquez refused to abandon those she loved. Let us honor her by refusing to abandon those who serve." Max padded into the room and sat beside Margaret, his warm weight pressing against her leg. She looked down at him. This dog who'd weathered starvation and loss and months of faithful waiting, and felt a surge of fierce, protective love. "We did it," she whispered to him. "We kept fighting. For you, for Elena, for everyone who needed someone to refuse to walk away." Max looked up at her with those dark, knowing eyes. His tail wagged slowly, and he leaned harder against her leg. Outside, Frank was talking to a young veteran about housing options, his voice patient and kind. Teresa was showing someone the pet-friendly shelter space, explaining that they'd never have to choose between safety and their animals. The world was still broken. The systems were still failing more people than they saved. But here, in this small converted church in a medium-sized town, people were fighting back. They were refusing to accept that veterans should die in storage units, that dogs should starve while standing guard, that people in need should be turned away because the paperwork wasn't right. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And sometimes, Margaret thought as she stroked Max's graying head, something was all you could give. The important thing was to give it anyway, to stand at the door like Max had and refuse to leave, to keep faith even when everything seemed hopeless. Elena Vasquez had taught them that. She'd taught them the cost of failing to see, the price of bureaucratic indifference, the human toll of broken systems. But Max had taught them something too, that loyalty mattered, that faith mattered, that refusing to abandon your post mattered even when, especially when, it seemed futile. Margaret left the memorial room and found Frank waiting for her in the parking lot. Max walked between them as they headed to their car, his pace steady and sure. The lights of the center glowed warm behind them, and inside, people were finding help, finding hope, finding someone who refused to give up on them. They drove home in comfortable silence. Max slept in the back seat, his soft snores filling the car. When they pulled into their driveway, he woke and followed them inside, going straight to his bed, the same old comforter from that first night, now supplemented with proper cushioning and his favorite toys. Margaret made tea. Frank turned on a baseball game with the sound low. Max settled on the floor between them, his head resting on Frank's foot, his body touching Margaret's leg. This was home. This was family. This was what they'd fought for, what Elena had wanted, what Max deserved. "Worth it?" Frank asked quietly, gesturing to encompass everything. The dog, the center, the years of fighting and advocating and refusing to accept that Elena's death should be meaningless. Margaret thought about their maxed-out credit cards, their postponed medical appointments, their smaller retirement savings. She thought about the stress, the exhaustion, the countless hours spent on the phone with bureaucrats and reporters and veterans who needed more than she could give. Then she looked at Max, sleeping peacefully, safe and loved and home. "Every penny," she said, "every moment, worth it." Frank smiled and took her hand. Outside, the night settled in, soft and dark. Inside, the house was warm with the quiet presence of survivors, people and dog, all scarred, all still healing, all refusing to give up. Max's paws twitched in his sleep. He was dreaming, Margaret thought. She hoped they were good dreams, running through fields, playing with Elena in whatever place she'd found peace, knowing that he'd kept faith, that he'd stood guard, that he'd refused to leave even when everything seemed lost. He'd been a good dog, the best dog. And they'd been lucky, so incredibly lucky, to find him that day in the storage unit, teeth bared and body wedged in the doorway, refusing to abandon his post. Some things, Margaret understood now, you didn't walk away from. Some fights you kept fighting, Even when you were tired, even when it cost more than you could afford, even when the outcome seemed hopeless. You stood guard. You kept faith. You refused to leave, just like Max had taught them.